So we will record today's program for folks who can't make it, and also live stream this to our YouTube channel where it will live after that. So we usually get a few folks joining, and we have a full registration today. So I imagine we'll get some folks joining us on YouTube as well. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight or this afternoon or whatever time it is where you're joining us for our AFO Café. It's been a few months since we've held one of these, so we're really excited to get these back on the schedule. We do have a program set for the next several months, so we're excited about some of the upcoming speakers. So stay tuned. Keep an eye out in your emails and our social media accounts for upcoming events. So hopefully many of you are members of AFO. If you're not, if you're joining us for the first time, if you're new to AFO, we are a professional society dedicated to the study and conservation of birds in their natural habitats. And we often pride ourselves on a bridge between professionals and avocational ornithologists. And in the last several years, we've really been pushing strong to create connections throughout Latin America. We just had a really exciting conference in Brazil with our friends at the Brazilian Ornithological Society and the Tropical Ornithological Society. We had about 400 people attending that. It was a really spectacular event, and we look forward to holding future congresses every 4 years or so. So this was the second one. The first one was in 2017 in Iguazu Falls, Argentina. And we just got back from Gramado, Brazil. So we're excited about those and certainly plan to continue them. We are already well underway planning our next conference, though, for next year. If you haven't seen, we will be meeting jointly with the Wilson Ornithological Society and the Society of Canadian Ornithologists. That's going to be in Peoria, Illinois, sort of that end of July, early August timeframe. Website is up already. We have information on our website as well. So we are currently accepting calls for workshops, symposia, and special events. We'll soon be opening, or after the new year, be opening the call for abstracts as well as travel awards and our caregiver awards. Wilson has done that for the last couple of years at their conferences, and we're excited to help make that happen for the conference this coming year as well. And hopefully that's something we'll be able to do moving forward. Our AFO cafes are sponsored by Avinet. Avinet is the business arm of AFO, and the proceeds from sales at Avinet help fund all the programming that we do. So that helps with our grants programs and all of the awards that we give to students and researchers throughout the Americas and globally. So hopefully you're already very familiar with Avinet. I'm sure most of you are. If you have ideas about what you'd like to see in upcoming AFO cafes, like I said, we're trying to get these back on a regular schedule now. Let us know, nominate yourself, or if you know somebody that would make for a really good speaker or a really great topic, please do get in touch. We would love to hear those ideas and continue this as long as we can. It's exciting to see so many people here today. Obviously, this is something folks seem to really enjoy. So we're happy to make that happen. Yeah. So with that, I'll turn it over to Judith to introduce Ryan.
Thanks, Matt. It's my pleasure to introduce Ryan, our speaker today. I nominated him, so all of you who would like to nominate somebody, you will get the chance to also introduce your speaker. Ryan is a lifelong birder. He grew up in Santa Cruz Mountains in California, and he received his bachelor's degree at UC Santa Cruz and then a PhD from Louisiana State University, where he studied molt strategies. and evolution. He's a very prolific writer. You can read his papers in over 25 peer-reviewed articles, and he's also an author of the Field Guide to the Birds of Bolivia. He studied not only the ecology and evolution of avian moult, but also distribution and conservation of birds in the Americas primarily. And most recently, he has been studying the populations of Mexican birds. And that's what he's going to be talking about today. So without further ado, please, Ryan, take it away.
Thanks so much, Edith. Appreciate it. Appreciate that introduction. I'll go ahead and share my screen so everybody can see my slides, and then we'll get going. How's that one? Yes, I can.
Yep, looks great.
Somebody give me a thumbs up or something. Okay, fantastic.
All good.
All right. But yeah, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for everybody coming out today and sitting at home and watching it from your computer. I really appreciate it. As Edith said, I'm now the science director at Klamath Bird Observatory. Just started here in June. Really excited. We're up in Southern Oregon, but I'm talking today about some stuff that I was working on my postdoc, which we're just wrapping up and trying to get into publication, more or less now-ish, at Occidental College, at the Moore Lab of Zoology at Occidental College, especially with the collaboration of our partners in Mexico at Conavio and at UNAM, and with Morgan Tingley at UCLA and other collaborators. Let's see, occasionally I'll look over, I got my slides over on my other screen over here, so that's why I'm peeking over every once in a while. So the idea of this project is to try to look at changes in bird populations and distributions over the last 100 years throughout Mexico. So what we want to understand with this project is what, if any, changes are there in bird populations and distributions over the past 100 years in Mexico. I think we're all kind of fairly familiar with the paper that came out in the US and Canada showing that we've lost 3 billion birds over the past 70 years or so. And that's based on lots of really good data, especially from Bird Banding Lab and BBS roots over the past few decades. But, we know less as we go farther south and farther into tropical countries, which is, where a lot of the avian diversity is. And one of the original impetuses, one of the main impetus for this project was we were working at the Moore Lab of Zoology at Occidental College, which is the world's largest collection of birds from Mexico. And, we're thinking about historical data in the forms of specimens. And one of the really important things about historical data is that we can't really go out and get more, right? We can go out and get more contemporary data about what bird populations are like now, but we have these really invaluable records of bird populations. We might call it a snapshot of evolution or snapshot of ecology of birds, back into the 1930s, 1920s. And one of the really important things about these specimens is, we can't go out and get more historical data. And so, we think we kind of have a duty, or, we thought it might be a good idea to use these specimens as much as possible to try to understand things like distributions and population change, because it's all we'll ever have. So we might as well use it, not just in the form of specimens, but in the form of field notes. So how can, what are ways that we can make these specimens as useful as possible, especially when looking at contemporary questions? And so our approach here for this project was to try to combine all available and useful data on bird occurrences between two main time periods. And I can get into the methodology a bit of why we chose these time periods. Maybe people have questions, but we chose a historical time period from 1932 to 1964, which was the main time when this guy in the picture there, Chester Lamb, was active collecting in Mexico. He collected over 60,000 specimens throughout Mexico in this 30-year time period. And there was a lot of other collecting going on. It was kind of a high time for field notes and specimen collecting in Mexico. And then we also chose another modern time period, the same 30 years, but going up until 2021. So by doing this, what we did was we kind of assumed that there was no change within those 30-year periods, and then left a 30-year period in between that we could look for change in. Of course, the assumption that there's no change in these 30-year periods is wrong, but by taking this very kind of broad, zoomed out approach, we were able to compare, data that was collected in really different ways and try to get some interesting answers out of it. And I'll go more into those methods. Oh, did I click off the screen or something? Whoops, sorry. Oh no. Apologies. Something's going on with my PDF viewer. All right. I'm slowly and painfully making this switch from Apple back to Windows, so pardon me. Everything's different. All right. So there are really two big hurdles to trying to understand change over time here. We have really different types of effort. For example, we're comparing, when we're trying to get all available data together, we're often comparing things like museum specimens to things like contemporary field notes. So part of this project, what we tried to do is go back to well-collected sites. So in the bottom there is us and our team going back to this spot in the Sierra de los Tuxtlas, right where Chester Lamb collected in, it was like 1940 something. But they're really different types of data, right? Specimen collecting, and even the notes that Lamb or the people, his collaborators might have taken at that time are pretty different from what we're taking at this time. So we have, if we want to get all the data together, we're going to be working with really different types of data. And another issue is that we really only have detection data, especially as we go back into time and look at field notes and specimens. And it's really hard to look at change if you only have detection data, right? You can't really understand that a species may have been extirpated by a site if you don't know that it's not there now. You also can't know that a species maybe colonized a site if you don't know that it wasn't there in the past. But fortunately, we can use the same tool to try to approach both of these problems. And that tool is modeling detection probability, trying to understand the probability that if a species was at a site, would it have been detected given the amount and the type of effort given. And so if we take these, we have detections and non-detections. What we really want is presence-absence data, right? We don't have presence-absence data. We do have detections and non-detections. So the idea here is to take these detections and non-detections and understand the amount and the quality of the effort that went into these detections and non-detections to change this detection non-detections into probabilistic presence-absence data. By combining detections and non-detections with probability of detection, then we might get a probabilistic presence-absence data. We'll never have true presence-absence data, but it's better than nothing. And the idea here, this is really just sort of like, in my mind, this is sort of a mathematical formalization for how I would think about this problem anyway. So if you were to tell me, okay, this site at this time, this species of bird has never been observed, how confident are you that that bird doesn't actually live at that site? So we're trying to, get absence data, right? I would want to know, okay, like, who's been there? What kind of effort did they put in? What were they doing? Were they just looking for one species? Were they doing a general census? Is it the right climate for that bird? Is it the right habitat for that bird? And so we kind of take all those variables, again, climate region, who was there? What were they doing? What was their experience like? What was the method of data collection? Was it collecting? Was it field notes? Was it recording, like putting on an ARU or something like that? How much effort was there? And one of the really important, one of the really good covariates here is how much of the expected diversity did the survey find? So what we did was we called a survey all the effort within 1 year within a certain grid cell. So everybody that went there throughout the whole year, we just called the survey. And we can have a guess by combining range maps of more or less how many species should be there. So if all the effort in a year only added up to about 10% of the expected diversity versus 90%, we have really different expectations about if a species was there and it wasn't detected, then how confident are we? Sorry, if a species wasn't detected, how confident are we that it wasn't actually there versus it just got missed? So by trying to understand the probability of detection, we can account for both these really different types of effort by incorporating that into the model, but also this problem that we only have presence data. We only have detection data. These models, so the whole idea here is to account for type 2 error, right? When you think that something wasn't there, but it actually was there. These models, the detection probability models, are occupancy models. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with occupancy modeling. the idea is to do a good job understanding and accounting for this type 2 error. But that means these models are actually really sensitive to type 1 error, and they can kind of be thrown off by data, by misidentifications or falsely plotted data or whatever. And so one of the things we did was we got together this data set of almost 9 million records, and we went through it by eye 3 times and removed everything that we couldn't confirm. So extraliminal things at weird time of year, stuff like that. We either tried to follow up on it, or if we couldn't follow up on it, we removed it to the best of our ability. So for example, I made these maps for every species, just like here, this gilded flicker. In both the historical and modern records, there's some that are either misplotted, mis-ID'd, couldn't figure out what was going on with them. We just took them out of the data set because, again, these models are good at having too little data, but they're not that good at having too much data that's not correct. And this is a lot of work, obviously. So we parsed this down into these big data sets of historical and modern records that did a pretty good job covering just about all of Mexico, especially the well-known areas. And we were able to build these occupancy models. Once we turned our detection, non-detection data into probabilistic presence-absence data, we were able to combine that with things like climate and land cover covariates to build occupancy models, to build a model in space of what the occupancy is of a species in the historical time period and the modern time period. And occupancy, just to give a quick definition, it's not the same as abundance. We're not necessarily modeling abundance or relative abundance. Occupancy is just, if you went to that place at that time and you went to the appropriate habitat, what is the probability that habitat would be occupied by that species? And it scales pretty well with abundance. You can kind of loosely think of this as relative to abundance, but it's not exactly the same thing. And we were just looking at presence absence by year, by species. We weren't looking at numbers counted by year, by species, even though, again, this does an okay job capturing that in a way. So by making historical and modern occupancy models for each species, we could then look at change in occupancy. So for this Basilotoris belli, this golden-browed warbler, what we found is throughout basically its entire range, except for maybe the extreme northwest, it's in pretty catastrophic decline. It's, the occupancy is declined by 50–60%. So, there's a 50 to 60% less chance that you go to any of these spots that it's actually occupied by a golden-browed warbler, where it would have been between 1930s and 1960s. And so here's another example with the hooded yellowthroat, this species of highland marshes in Mexico. Again, we see catastrophic decline throughout a lot of its range. And we can also get an understanding of the predictors of occupancy and predictors of decline, like what kind of habitat it's in, what kind of climate it's in, and start to put this stuff together to try to answer some bigger questions about what's going on with birds throughout Mexico. So one of the first big questions we can ask is just where are these changes occurring? Are species declining throughout Mexico or in certain places? And so what we can do is we can take our models, like this little emerald-chinned hummingbird, which is declining basically throughout its whole range in the Chiapas Highlands in the southern Sierra Madre Oriental, and just flatten it, right? So we could take the probability of occurrence where we have a 95% probability of occurrence and just flatten it to its range. Just make a range map that's, just a little more informed than the bird life range maps we started out with. And we can just smash all these together with our historical occupancy models and take a look at the historical avian diversity of Mexico. So again, we look at this, especially the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, the low humid rainforest in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec up into the Chiapas Highlands have incredible diversity, which, we all know or knew, I think, about Mexico. We also know that this is an area that's been heavily deforested, right? So if we do the same thing for modern avian diversity, we see drastic declines, especially in the most diverse areas, the tropical, humid rainforests and forests going up into the Chiapas Highlands, but especially centered around the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. So just first pass, we see, huge reductions in total avian diversity at sites in Mexico, especially in the most diverse sites. And when we just look at total predicted numbers, so we go to a grid cell and we predict the list of birds in the historical time period and the list of birds in the modern time period. Some of these places, the list is, almost 200 birds shorter than it used to be. again, in these really kind of tropical, highly diverse sites. But you'll notice that just about all of Mexico does have some decline. You know, even that dark purple getting up into 0, that is 10, 20, 30 species fewer. A lot of Mexico is 50 to 100 species fewer. And if we look at just total species with some evidence of decline, you know, it's basically all of them. So this is, you know, looking at birds where we have a high confidence that they're there or not, but just species, like the ranges of species with some evidence of decline, it's a lot of them. But of course, just change in total species doesn't tell the whole story, right? So for example, a lot of these lowland tropical rainforest birds like the Gabriela ruficata here, the rufous-tailed jacamar on the left, that's a lowland rainforest bird. It's lost basically all of its habitat throughout Mexico, and it's in steep decline. But in a really similar area, these Thropus albus, this yellow-winged tanager, has increased a lot, right? This is a bird of forest edges, commensal with people, with towns, stuff like that. And so, you know, by losing one and gaining another, we're not seeing, you know, we wouldn't see any change in the total species number. So just change in total species doesn't tell the whole story. And one of the ways we can get at that, going back to this emerald chin hummingbird example, instead of just flattening where the species does live and did live, we can look at the change in occupancy. We can look at the historical versus modern occupancy and look at the change. And just for, if folks are wondering, this change in occupancy is explicitly modeled. It's not just make the modern, make the historical, and subtract. It's explicitly modeled. But then what we can do is we can flatten that. We can take the posterior probability of occupancy decline and just say, okay, where are we highly confident that this species is declining, and flatten that to get a distribution of decline. Distribution of, these are the areas where we're statistically confident that this species is declining. And we can match all those together too and look at, by site in Mexico, how many species are experiencing significant decline. And again, it looks pretty similar to some of the past maps. We have the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, the Chiapas Islands, the Sierra Madre Oriental with 150, maybe 200 species almost, where we have a high probability that they're declining, and up into, you know, the tropical dry forest of Northwest Mexico as well. Another thing to point out is that, you know, 0 species is white. So there's nowhere in Mexico where there's nothing declining, which I think most people would expect. But a lot of places, pretty much everywhere, at least, you know, 50, 60, 80 species of birds have declined since the historical period. And then when we look at percent of species with historical with decline, so again, the number of species is correlated to how many species there are there. Okay, great, like that's expected. But when we look at it as a percentage, that pattern still holds up. So in the highly diverse areas, we have a higher proportion of species are declining. Again, up to 50% of species, we are able to find statistical declines in. And one thing I kind of want to point out is that, you know, I was a little surprised that we found this such a strong signal, because again, we're looking at data that's so spread out over a long time period that were taken from in a bunch of different manners in a bunch of different ways, and we had to take a very broad look to be able to even compare the data. And so to me, the fact that we were able to get these signals means, you know, the actual declines that are happening are probably a lot more, if that makes sense to everybody. One of the things is that occupancy decline is occurring across all ecozones. If we look at the main ecozones, the Great Plains, tropical wet forest, tropical dry forest, temperate Sierras, you know, something on average about 30% of species are declining throughout all ecozones. And so, while the highest proportions tend to be in tropical humid forests, it's occurring just about everywhere. So if we just look at how many species are declining versus not declining, so this plot here, what we have on the y-axis is species, and I didn't label them all because there's no way you'd be able to read them, but every one of those horizontal lines is a species, and then the dotted line is no change at all. So everything to the left of the dotted line is predicted to be declining, with significant declines in red. So that's where the posterior distribution doesn't overlap with 0. Non-significant declines, or declines that we couldn't be statistically confident in, are in orange. Increases that we weren't sure of are in green, and increases we were sure of are in blue. And of course, you know, one thing right off the bat, you can see almost almost everything is declining, right? More than 3/4 of the species are declining in some way. And in 20% of them, we were able to detect statistically significant declines. Lots of them, even a lot of those yellow ones that do overlap with zero, they're pretty far off, right? There's probably a pretty big decline, but it's hard to tell for sure. It's hard to have statistical confidence. And again, this also makes me feel good about our methods. If we had really, really narrow 95% confidence intervals by comparing, a bird Chester Lamb shot in 1932 with a bird that, a Canavio surveyor heard in 2020 or something like that, that would be a little weird. So, I have some confidence in the way this turned out, which I think is pretty cool, but also pretty sad. The takeaway here is the vast majority of birds in Mexico are declining to such an extent that we were able to detect that by looking at data that was collected in wildly different ways. So again, these catastrophic decline species that are losing just about all their range in Mexico are often these lowland tropical rainforest birds in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, where most of that habitat has been lost. Microropius chiensis is an example that's just about gone from Mexico. This Gallirufa cauda, like I showed you before, Caryothrustes poliogaster, all birds that like this pretty intact lowland tropical rainforests. Okay, so that's kind of alpha diversity, right? We're looking at overall changes in total species. But Mexico is really unique, not just in that it has a high alpha diversity, but it also has really high beta diversity. One of the really cool things about Mexico is it has all these different regions that have different groups of birds. And it's, I think, one of the reasons folks that are interested in birding Mexico or like birding Mexico like it so much is you can drive a couple hours in a different direction and see like a totally different assemblage of birds. So Mexico has really high beta diversity. There's really high turnover in communities from one place to another. So we also wanted to investigate what is happening with this beta diversity, this heterogeneity in bird communities. So this is a bit of a complicated figure, but I'll walk you through it. So if we just look at panel A, that's a plot of each point is one of our grid cells, one of our little hexes in Mexico, and how far they are from each other is how different the communities are from each other. So basically what we see is in black, which is the historical time period, the communities are more different from each other. So they're more unique. And in red, in the modern time period, that whole difference space has shrunk. So every individual hex point in Mexico, the bird community is more similar to each other than it used to be. So it looks like we're losing this community dissimilarity, this heterogeneity of bird communities in Mexico. If you look at B and C, these are principal component analyses essentially of the bird communities. So the more different the colors are, the more different the communities are. So you can sort of see in blue is like the tropical desert, sort of northwest desert, fading into that teal is tropical dry forest. You've got the Yucatan shows up in hot pink that's a little similar to the coastal Oaxaca. It's hard to see on B and C, but you can see these sharp colors are a little more fuzzy. They're a little more faded into each other. And that shows up better in D. And so D is just the distance from the centroid. Any community, how different is it from the average community in Mexico? So all of Mexico has lost distance from the centroid. But again, if you look in this, Isthmus of Tehuantepec area where it's most diverse, it has lost most of this community uniqueness, essentially, in Mexico. I hope that all made sense. I know this is a little bit complicated here. So that's looking at community difference in space. How different are different communities from each other? How different were they and how different are they now? They seem to be less different now than they used to be. But we can also look at community turnover in time, just comparing at each point in Mexico, how similar is the community now to what it used to be? And so here, as we get more yellow, the community is less similar to what it used to be. So 0 would be the community of birds is exactly the same as it used to be. And then the more yellow you get, the more non-analogous the community is now compared to what it used to be. Again, a lot of the same stuff shows up, but especially now we see a little bit of signal of elevation here. So we're losing a lot of species in these low elevations, but we also found, and I'll get into this in a little bit, another thing we found is similar to what other similar projects have found, is that species are moving up slope. So not only are they declining, probably from habitat loss, but with warming climates, species seem to be moving upslope. And so we see higher community turnover in high elevation stuff as, you know, the birds that were there may be declining, the birds that live down below are now moving up into this area. So it's kind of an additional thing we see when we look at community turnover in space versus in time. I hope this all makes sense. Feel free to ask questions later. So in general, communities are less similar where diversity is highest, but also we see communities being less similar as we move up in elevation compared to what they used to be. And that also kind of makes sense in that, you know, if you get birds coming from down below, the closer you are to sea level, the fewer birds there are that used to live below you that now live with you, right? If you're at sea level, nobody is necessarily coming up from underwater to invade your habitat like it might be when you're up in the mountains. Another question we wanted to look at is what types of birds are changing? What sort of associations, what sort of habitat associations might there be? As it's probably not super surprising to anybody, we found a negative association with wild woodlands. So on the left are birds that tend to avoid wild woodlands, your great-tailed grackles and yellow-winged tanagers. And on your right tends to be birds that associate with or rely on wild woodlands. So the birds that avoid wild woodlands tend to be increasing. Birds that rely on wild woodlands tend to be decreasing. If we look at association with human settlements, we see the exact opposite. You know, on the left, your sage thrashers and white-collared manakins that tend to avoid human settlements are decreasing. On your right, your grue-billed awnings and monk parakeets, incudoves that tend to live with human settlements are increasing. And when we break all of our land cover covariates into like human influence versus non-human influence, they all kind of follow the same thing. So if you tend to avoid human influence, you tend to be decreasing. If you tend to look for human influence, you tend to be increasing, and vice versa. Okay, so we found, I take this as a decent signal of habitat change. It was hard to get a close look at habitat change going back to the 1930s because unfortunately we don't have like awesome satellite data going back to the 1930s like we have now. But we did see, what seems to be pretty decent signal of habitat change. Untangling the role of climate change versus habitat change, especially when you're going back in time like that, is pretty difficult. It's difficult to understand what happened when and why and where. We know that we're losing forest birds in areas where forests are being taken down or fragmented. We have some signal to show that occupancy change in birds is associated with climate covariates. This just PC 1, 2, and 3 are 12 climate covariates condensed, which roughly correspond to temperature, precipitation, and seasonality. One of the things, kind of little thought experiments I did here, was reconstructed modern avian diversity under a climate change only scenario that is no habitat change. So I used the historical habitat layers in the modern climate and land use change only. So no change in climate, only change in land use. And when we look at the difference between the observed and predicted modern diversity, if there's no habitat change, we see increases in diversity as you go up in elevation. So the signal here, if we only look at climate change, is like stuff's moving up slope. We get declines in the lowlands, increases in total diversity in the highlands. When we look at land use change, we see a little bit of that signal. We see stuff decreasing in the lowlands, but if you look at the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, it's like decreased way more, right? And then if you look up in the mountains, there's way less diversity. So it seems like stuff's getting kind of pushed up mountains, but then land use change is just kind of cutting down diversity in general where it happens, if that makes sense. Another thing we found is that species that have narrower elevational ranges tend to be declining. So this orange-billed sparrow has a pretty narrow elevational range, lives in lives in low habitats, tends to be declining. This plot here is elevational breadth. So on the left, you have birds with really narrow elevational ranges. On the right, you have birds with broad elevational ranges. The broader the elevational range, the better they tend to be doing. The narrower the elevational range, the worse they tend to be doing. And that could be a signal of both climate change and land use change. It probably is. Another thing we found is that regional endemics tend to be decreasing. So this is a plot of birds in the Rio Balsas drainage. And what you have here on the x-axis is the proportion of their range in Mexico that is encompassed by the Rio Balsas bird conservation region. So farther on the right, you have birds that are more endemic to the Rio Balsas drainage. So Xenotrichus mexicanus, 40% of its global range is in the Balsas drainage. And then farther to the left, you get more range-wide generalists, if that makes sense. For just about every bird conservation region we did this for, we found this similar signal that the more endemic you are to a conservation region, the worse you're doing. So birds that are specialists in these eco regions tend to be declining, whereas birds that are more eco-region generalists tend to either be doing fine or increasing. So again, looking at this, what I was talking about, the homogenization of bird communities, you have, of all the birds in Mexico, the birds that tend to be more specialists and more limited to certain eco-regions and limited to certain elevational ranges are decreasing, whereas the birds that are more generalist, have broader ecological requirements and broader elevational ranges, seem to be increasing. And that probably all contributes to this homogenization of communities of birds in Mexico. We do see occupancy decline is pretty is across all trophic niches. We don't see big differences in trophic niches. I think, just like some other stuff we find, insectivores, aerial insectivores tend to be declining a lot, but really all the trophic niches are declining. Okay, so just to go back over it. Over the past 20th century, we found the occupancy decline in birds is widespread, both spatially and ecologically throughout Mexico, although it tends to be most concentrated in the areas that have historically had the highest diversity and the most distinctive communities. Declining species tend to have narrow elevational ranges and are associated with less disturbed habitats. And in diverse regions, a lot of declining species are being replaced by generalist species. So even though we have a decline in total diversity, that's in fact being masked by other birds coming into that region, the decline in the diversity that was once there. So what we found over this kind of big analysis that we tried to do over the past 100 years is that avian diversity in Mexico has both declined and homogenized. So we've lost both alpha and beta diversity in Mexico, which are both really important aspects of diversity, especially in Mexico. One thing I want to point out is Mexico is, it's number 3 on lists of countries. It has the 3rd most endemics of any country, bird endemics of any country in the world. The uniqueness of Mexico's bird communities, the importance of the uniqueness of Mexico's bird communities cannot be understated, and we find declines in that as well. And with that, I have lots of people to acknowledge, but I'll just leave this slide up that hopefully will pique some curiosity and some questions for all of you. So thanks for having me, and thanks for listening, everybody.
That was great, Ryan. Thank you. Yeah, at this time, everyone feel free to turn on your cameras and microphones, and yeah, we'd welcome any questions for Ryan. So I can start us off while people are thinking, because there's a lot. Oh, Scott, go ahead. Please do. Yeah.
Hey, Ryan, I had a quick question about the basically the coarseness of some of your historical points. So I know when you get to the point where you're analyzing land use and modeling and stuff, you're probably rasterizing, creating a grid of probabilities like you're talking about. But it just struck me when you were talking about when you went through that, like almost 9 million different records and were taking stuff out, sort of the specificity of the points. I know you had to choose a point for, for a record or for sort of a modern data point. But I was just curious with some of these historical collections, how coarse was the actual locality that you were dealing with?
That's a great question. So one of the first big steps in this project, in fact, that was happening before I was at Occidental was verification of field notes and of these specimens. So, pardon. A big part of this data came from the Mexican Bird Atlas, which was put together by Tom Peterson and Adolfo Navarro, which has various levels of coarseness and verification. But luckily, it's all marked off, you know, like who looked at it, when it was looked at, what was put into it. And that was actually a great first step for us because we could take out unverified stuff and everything. But there was also a multi-year, I told you, I did this at Occidental College, which was the biggest collection of birds in Mexico.
Yeah.
There was a multi-year effort to verify and change localities that needed to be verified or changed. So John McCormack was the curator there, and James Maley, who was the collections manager just before I was there and overlapped with me, really went through every specimen and went through the field notes in anticipation of this project, went through the field notes and the itineraries of these collectors to try to get the locations as precise as possible. And so we dumped stuff that wasn't as precise as we needed it. We had our hex grids were, I think, 16 kilometers we went with. And so things that couldn't be verified to that precision level, we dumped as best as possible. You know, with 9 million records, I'm sure some stuff, you know, didn't make the cut, but there was a big effort to independently verify localities based on, you know, where they were, you know, what their field notes said, stuff like that. I did a little bit of extra of that, looking into that stuff by plotting collectors' itineraries. And so like I just took their specimen by day, month, year, whatever, and just like mapped it all out to make sure they weren't like all here one day and then the specimen was over there and then back or something, because that kind of stuff is pretty common. So there's sort of 3 different levels that we did our best to verify that stuff with. Obviously some stuff got through. We also, like with the eBird data, you know, a lot of it we just looked at, you know, like, you know, Mexican chickadees, you know, there's some places where like, you know, there was one pretty common problem where people would get off a cruise in Acapulco and go up into the mountains, but they would put their eBird checklist right where they got off the boat or something. And it's like, okay, it's only a couple miles that way, but like clearly that elevational data is bad. And so we did our best, you know, with that stuff. It's never going to
for sure
be perfect, but we put a lot of effort into it from a lot of different angles.
That's awesome. So yeah, with that size of hex, then you probably, if they mess the threshold, they're in. You didn't like wait. You didn't wait the points, did you, for their?
No, but you know, one of the things was with it being this rough is, you know, we only did presence absence by a year. A lot of the land cover data that was from the, you know, these broad long-term projects looking at, you know, human influence. And so it's not highly precise land data, kind of on purpose. And so one of the things was, you know, again, with the data coming from so many different sources, to try to keep our view as, you know, kind of broad. Like we didn't zoom in with a lot of precision on a lot of stuff, just to see what signal we could detect in overall change, if that makes sense. So no, we didn't necessarily weight stuff, but we did tend to take, you know, if there were 10 different detections in a year or something, it was only yes, no, and we tried to take the best detection for the yes, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Everything was crystal clear. It's great.
So I guess what are your recommendations, or I guess what would be the conservation implications here? Like if you really had to boil it down to like greatest needs, or a synthesis of that. I know it's probably a very loaded, challenging question, but what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's fairly clear to me, at least, that land use had a much stronger effect than climate change. Climate change is affecting birds and will continue to do so. The signal is less strong. The chance that we're going to do anything about it is a lot less. You know, to me, this, I don't want to say confirms, but you know, the way that bird conservation is currently done, which is concentrating on small range species that are in trouble that are emblematic of a certain ecoregion seems to be supported by these results, right? We need to conserve areas that are highly diverse. I mean, I would like to reforest, all the sugar cane, in the lowlands of Thistles, Tehuantepec, and Veracruz and stuff. If we could just pull that out and replant lowland rainforest, that'd be ideal. And get harp eagles and scarlet macaws back there and stuff. But I think the targeted conservation of birds that are have small ranges and specific needs seems to be the most important thing here. And not to say the conservation implications is that we're doing great, but the results seem to support that model. That is kind of the current model. Just we need more money. We need more ability to do that.
Yeah, I think we all agree with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, I have another one if other people don't.
Please do, go for it.
Yeah, so you had so much awesome research you've done in Mexico, and that's really interesting, everything you've shown. So since given the organization you're with and what you've done and all the work there, I'd be interested to hear your opinions on what you think, what form of improvement or assistance in the ongoing data collection efforts or analysis efforts in Mexico. Like I know I just saw you at the IBOC recently, what form of help out there or increased data collection type would you say is most helpful for further research and conservation for Mexico and the birds of Mexico?
What I'd say is, a lot of these data, the majority of the modern data are from eBird, and the majority of those data are non-professional bird watchers. It would be really useful if the data became more spread out. It's so much of the data, especially from places like Mexico, where a lot of the data are, foreigners who are going to a specific spot to see a specific bird. That's really great. But, going to places, and, I know a lot of Mexico is dangerous right now, but, going to places where you could contribute more can be really helpful. And, one of the ways I think about it, and I'm a bird watcher, and my own bird watching is like, we're kind of all, those of us that go bird watching, kind of on this spectrum from what I think of as like an experiencer to a contributor. Whereas, the experience is all about what was my experience. Like, oh, I got taken by a guide to see this bird and I experienced the thing, as opposed to a contributor. Like, I went out and took these notes and contributed it to general knowledge. And when you're going just to experience versus when you're going just to contribute, you often do things in very different ways. You might experience, you go where the bird's going to be seen, where it's been seen 100 times before, so you can experience it. Whereas contributing, you might go look for that bird somewhere it hasn't been seen before. And I don't mean that as like a dig on the experience, because good experiences are great, but we're all somewhere in that spectrum. And one thing that I think, we could think of as a positive way that I think we could encourage the general birding community would be to fit more contribution in with their experiences, or think about where they are on the experienced contributor spectrum, and think about where and when and how they could be contributing more than experiencing. Because it's cool if you saw that one bird that everybody else has seen in the spot where everybody else has seen it, but are you contributing any knowledge then? And I don't mean that as like an insult or something. What I mean is that if we think about ways we can contribute, there might be some really, so many times, it's like you go to some really well-known, well-birded area. It's like, well, what about that mountain over there? What about that valley over there? I don't know. Nobody's ever been there. So it's kind of my long-winded 2 cents on that.
Okay. That's cool. Yeah, and I think people probably who have been birding a long time and have high confidence, they could be particularly valuable, obviously, if they took the time.
That too.
I had a question for you, Ryan. It was a great presentation. I really felt like I learned a lot. Do you know of any like similar efforts in other Latin American countries to kind of gauge this diversity with the historical data? Do you know of anybody putting projects like that together, or is this just mostly a Mexico focus right now?
Yeah, the other big project that is pretty similar to this is going on in Colombia. They're doing things, their methodology is a little different. In fact, a little closer to what our original methodology was to concentrate on revisiting individual sites. This project started with a high concentration on revisiting individual sites that had been well collected. With COVID shutting that down and with us wanting to expand, we expanded to doing countrywide. The Columbia Resurvey project is still more concentrated on that and involving collecting more than we did. We did no modern collecting in association with this. And they're doing great stuff, and we're working together with them to share methodology and analytical power and stuff like that. And that's a really cool project. And they're doing a little, we're putting out this big paper and doing some follow-ups, whereas they've been publishing a few, site-specific resurveys and stuff, and then I think it will be concatenated into a big survey. And then, a lot of the methods here were based on the Grinnell resurvey out of UC Berkeley in California. But that's the only other one. That's the only big resurvey project that I know of in Latin America is Colombia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Ryan while we're here?
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it, Christopher.
You said that Occidental College has the largest collection of Mexican birds in a museum collection. Did you happen to find any passenger pigeon specimens by any chance in there? I've always been curious to see if passenger pigeons ever went south into Mexico.
Oxy has, I think, 2, but I don't think they're from Mexico.
Okay.
It's a great question whether they did or didn't occur in Mexico. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I think Occidental has a couple specimens that were, somebody traded something for back in the 50s. I think they're from Ohio or something like that.
Oh, nice. Right on.
It's a good question, though.
Thank you. And then if we have any further questions for you after the chat, after your talk, can you drop your email in the chat in case we want to reach out?
Gladly.
Okay. Thank
We'll
you.
do that right now.
Thank you.
If I can find it. There we go.
Yeah, Tanya?
Hi, hello. Thanks for sharing your research. I am wondering, within all the data that you have collected and also the models that already existed, is it possible to create like a predictive model to generate like successful conservation efforts in the next years? I mean, not just thinking in just the declination, I mean, because we know what will happen if we continue, but rather the other way around.
That's a fantastic idea, and that is our plan for the next step here, is to predict all these models into the future given various climate and land use scenarios. So yes, that's exactly what we're hoping to follow up this by doing.
Okay, and sorry, the next question is, and you are already thinking like networks or of collaboration in Mexico that could support this? Because I mean, for this, of course, you need a lot of institutions, but also like community to support the lands stay preserved,
yeah. Yeah, so our main collaborator here for community and government integration in Mexico is CONABIO, the Comisión Nacional de Biodiversidad, with our collaborators and co-authors on this paper, Humberto Garcia and Vicente Rodriguez, and they not only are, they're our main contact for land management decisions, but they also have a big network of bird observers throughout Mexico, the Red de Observadores de Aves, which we, in the field work here, we did a couple training workshops with them and collaborated with them extensively on their data. So that's our main, CONABIO is our main partner for that kind of stuff in Mexico. We'll also be, when we publish this paper, hopefully very soon, we'll be releasing all these data, for free. So all the models and everything, people will be able to use and work with, and that'll be especially important for Canabia, who's really interested in working with these models. And so yeah, I think that answers the question.
Any others? Well, this is really great. Ryan, thanks again for taking time to share your work. It's really impressive stuff. It's great to see this all synthesized. So thank you again. Thanks everyone for joining us. Stay tuned for upcoming cafes. Just a reminder, we are in renewal season. So if you are an AFO member, take care of that soon. If you're not, now's a great time to join us. Hope to see many of you in Peoria next year, but we'll see you all soon for the next cafe. Have a great weekend, everyone.